Good to go? All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to House Economic Matters. Today is Thursday, January 25th. It's a full moon for whatever it's worth on the chair's calendar. Today we have our fiscal and budget briefing. I believe David, right? I remember you're here every year, man. 6 years running. Thank you so much for coming back. We'll let him get through his briefing and then everybody can ask questions.
Good, thank you. I'm going to go through just the kind of what we call the quick look part of our fiscal briefing document, which you have on your desk. So starting on page number 1, it says quick look at the top. And then at the end, if you have time, I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. So if you look at that first page at the top, it shows the total funds in the budget are 63 billion for fiscal 25. That's a decrease of 1.1 billion from fiscal 24. The reason that the budget is decreasing is last year you had an extraordinary amount of general fund surplus that the General Assembly invested both in one-time capital projects using cash, and then also you put 900 million into the Blueprint Fund and 100 million into the Transportation Trust Fund. All those things were one time. They go away this year, and that's what's driving the budget decrease. In terms of the general fund, which will be most of my focus, the governor leaves a fund balance at the end of fiscal 25 of just over $100 million. And he has about $2.3 billion in the state's rainy day fund. That's about 9.4% of revenue. So there's a healthy amount of cash reserves under the governor's spending plan. Now, if you look at the next page, this shows that the governor has nearly $1 billion of budget balancing actions that require the enactment of legislation. So I just want to highlight, since these will be bills that you'll all have to vote on at some point. The first section of things that require legislation relate to revenues. There's about 106 million of new revenues. The first item, the 40 million, the large item, is kind of an esoteric thing. The state has a revenue estimate every year that the Board of Revenue Estimates does. And they come up with what they think is the right number. And then they look at the page 2. Okay. All right, so this revenue volatility, the Board of Revenue Estimate sets it's what it thinks is the right amount of revenue. If capital gains and other non-withholding income tax are higher than the 10-year average that they've been, they are by statute they're required to discount the amount. They're supposed to discount it by 140 million this year, which they did. The administration wants to lower that discount to 100 million so that they get 40 million more to spend. The other kind of notable revenue item relates to lottery agent commissions. Back in 2002, the General Assembly raised the lottery agent commissions from 5.5% of their sales to 6% of their sales. The governor is proposing to take it back to the 5.5%, and he's proposing to lower the commission they get for cashing a winning ticket from 3% of the winning ticket's value to 2% of the ticket. And that saves you about $35 million. I'm certain you'll all hear from your local lottery agent. In terms of transfers to the general fund, the biggest item there is the state has about 250 million in what's called the dedicated purpose account, which is an account that money is set aside in to fund sort of multi-year initiatives. It's 250 million for cybersecurity. The governor's taking 150 million out and sending it to the general fund, saying we're not going to spend this money this year. The other notable item on that list is the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. So the state is self-insured for its employees. We haven't had really layoffs in many years. We've built up a large fund balance in our Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. So the governor's transferring some of that excess money to the general fund. Under spending reductions, he's got about 677 million in reductions that can require legislative action. About 500 million is putting less money into the rainy day fund. And that's because he already has 2.3 billion in the rainy day fund and doesn't feel like we need to put another 500 million, which is required by statute. So that's why there needs to be a statutory change. Policy wise, the two notable cuts on that cuts list are the Selinger formula. This is the funding for private independent colleges in the state. It would be reduced by about $64 million. So they would be going from about 135 million in the current year to 70 million in fiscal 25. The idea here is that right now we provide assistance to those private schools for every student, both graduate and undergraduate. The governor wants to limit it to assistance for their undergraduate students. Most of the cut, like 55 million or so, is to Johns Hopkins because they're the private school that has most of the graduate students. The other change relates to the CADE formula, which is how we fund our community colleges. Governor's proposing a $22 million change in statute, and both of these, Selinger and CADE, are permanent changes, not just for this year. So the governor is saying that we've given a lot of increased funding to the community colleges over the last few years, and that we need to kind of rebase what we're giving them. And he's proposing this $22 million reduction. The last section on that chart actually is new spending that the governor is proposing that's contingent on legislation establishing the new programs he's proposing. The biggest item is the Enough Act, which is a $15 million item. It grows, as we understand it, to about $50 million in the out years. The other larger item is the Center for Firearm Violence Prevention and Intervention that the governor is proposing to create at a cost of $10 million in fiscal 25. All right, so let's go to the next page, page 3. So on page 3, I think this is probably the most critical chart in the document. It looks at what we call the structural budget outlook for the general fund. So when I say structural budget, I'm talking about ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. So it ignores fund balance and transfers that are one time in terms of revenues. So can our ongoing revenues support the spending commitments the state has made? In the current year's budget, as the bars on the chart show you, the administration thinks they're just under 500 million of a structural deficit, and they're able to have a balanced budget even with a structural deficit because they're using fund balances and so forth. By the administration's estimate, they get to a structural gap of $3.5 billion by fiscal 29. That represents about 12% of general fund revenues in fiscal 29. This is an extraordinarily large projected structural deficit. The last time we saw something of this magnitude was during the Great Recession. And obviously that was when the economy was poor. And we do not normally see this kind of magnitude of challenge without there being a recession. So it is concerning, in part because if we get a recession in the next couple of years, that would just pile on to the deficit and make it a very daunting task to bring the budget into balance. The dotted lines there is DLS is a little bit more optimistic than the administration, but only a little bit. It's still about a $3 billion shortfall in fiscal rainy day fund balance than we were assuming. The bottom part of the chart just shows you, well, where were the cuts? Where are the spending changes from what we were projecting in December? The biggest solution, 500 million of the savings, was that there was a lot of capital projects that were being planned to, they were going to plan to use cash in fiscal 25. And instead, the governor moved those to bonds, which saves 500 million of cash. The other significant savings is the Medicaid program. The governor's estimate is about 233 million less in general funds. We're surprised by that, to be frank, because the governor has a higher enrollment forecast, so more people and lower costs. So we'll be investigating that further and briefing appropriations at the appropriate time, whether we think Medicaid is adequately funded. The other thing I would note in that chart is that you see there's a big increase for enhancements and initiatives. And so we highlight on the next page, page 5, the details of sort of the surprises in the budget, the things the governor chose to do on a discretionary basis and were outside of the norm. The biggest item is $150 million general fund support for transportation. It would fund WMATA costs, operating costs at WMATA. WMATA is having financial difficulties in part because in recent years, they've been living off of federal stimulus money. The stimulus money has gone away, and now they need to backfill for it. The governor is highlighting that by providing general funds to help the Transportation Trust Fund meet these costs, he was able to avoid cuts in transportation that he'd announced back in December. For example, local highway user revenues, he had proposed a cut of about $60 million. And by putting some general funds into transportation, he's able to avoid that cut. For this year, his Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act makes that same cut next year. So it's a temporary reprieve for the local highway user and some of the other things that he proposed in December. The other big item is the governor was more generous than expected in terms of state employee compensation. The employee compensation package costs about $350 million in general funds this year. It includes a 3% COLA for all state employees, employee increments, which on average are about a 2.5% salary increase for employees who get them. And then he's providing an extra employee increment for those individuals who've worked for 4.5 years or longer with the state. So it's a fairly generous package. It helps to address the very high vacancy levels we have in state government. Currently, about 10% of executive branch positions are vacant. There's some agencies that have had a great deal of trouble filling positions. For example, correctional officers is an area where we've, for a number of years, have struggled to fill the positions. So those are the two major initiatives in the governor's budget. You can see there's a lot of smaller items there that you can look at your leisure. At the bottom of page 5, we just get into some of the other key features of the budget. K through 12 education grows $450 million, or about 5% in the 25 budget. Fully funds all the Kerwin enhancement rollout that was expected this year. In terms of healthcare, the provider rates go up 3%. So we're going to say 3% more to providers who serve the developmentally disabled, who provide behavioral health services, and serve a lot of the Medicaid clients in kind of community-based services. Turning to page 6, one of the biggest investments in the budget is this $488 million of new general funds for child care scholarships. These are subsidies for lower income families for child care. The reason it's such a massive increase in funding is that we had an enormous jump in participation in fiscal 23, about 10,000 more kids participating, going from roughly 23,000 to 33,000 or so, and that has driven up the cost. So there's a shortfall in the current year that the governor is closing, a little over 200 million of the money, and then he's trying to fully fund the program in fiscal 25. Just a couple other things I'll mention. In the Transportation Trust Fund, in addition to the $150 million that I already talked about, the governor is also using general obligation bonds to help fund WMATA, $167 million of general obligation bonds, and $20 million of bonds to help fund the Howard Street Tunnel project. So there's a lot of state support for transportation outside of the trust fund this year, given that the trust fund is under a lot of stress. Another major initiative the governor has in the budget is he set aside $90 million for the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, SEIF, to support the climate pollution reduction plan that's been proposed. That money goes into the dedicated purpose account and could be spent over multiple years. It does require legislation to use the SEIF money for this purpose, and he has a provision in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act to allow the SEIF money to be used in this way. Most of the rest of the chart, the bullets on that page are on the capital budget. I'll just note the one that might be of interest. The General Assembly had asked through the Spending Affordability Committee that the governor leave you $200 million of general obligation bonds to allocate as you wish. The governor left you $50 million. So it's a little bit less for legislative bond initiatives and other legislative adds to the capital budget than there usually is. All right, turning to page 7, we just try to hit on some of the major legislative issues that we think the at least certainly Appropriations Committee will be dealing with. One is the general fund stress that I showed you. That budget outlook is very challenging. And it's really the same story for the Transportation Trust Fund and for the Maryland Emergency Medical Systems Operation Fund, which is also struggling with like a long-term deficit forecast. So those are sort of the major issues that we see. On page 8, the one other major issue I would just note is a few years back, many years back really, the state proposed to move retirees who are eligible for Medicare into Medicare Part D for their prescription drug coverage. There was a lot of litigation around this issue that has finally been resolved. And the state is planning to, consistent with statute, move those folks into Medicare Part D in calendar 2025. It saves $50 million in fiscal 25, over $100 million a year going forward. The last thing I want to talk about, I'm going to skip a page and go to page 10. It's kind of one of the drivers of all that general fund stress I talked about is the Blueprint Fund. And so the Blueprint Fund is the revenue source to support the Kerwin implementation, the K through 12 education enhancements that are being rolled out through 2034. And so what this graphic is trying to do is show you how we've been paying for them and what the challenge is. And I don't know that you have color version. So I'll say the bottom bar in the chart shows you the ongoing revenues for the Blueprint Fund, which are our casino revenues for education, as well as some of the state's sales tax. About 12% of the sales tax is deposited into the Blueprint Fund. And that generates 1.3 to 1.4 billion a year. And in recent years, in fiscal 24 and in the 25 budget, it covers most of the costs of the Kerwin implementation. The rest of those costs are being covered by the lighter colored bar, which is the surplus funds in the Blueprint Fund. The General Assembly put a lot of extra money into the Blueprint Fund in recent years to make sure that there was adequate resources to roll this out. And so with the combination of the new ongoing revenues plus the fund balance gets us through fiscal 26, fully funding the implementation. In fiscal 27, you see there's a bar on top of the light bars, $429 million. That is the general funds that would be needed because we don't have enough Blueprint funds to cover all of the implementation costs. And you can see in fiscal 28 and 29, that number goes to well over $2 billion. And it will keep growing in subsequent years until we finish the Kerwin rollout in 2034. And that is the major driver of general fund stress in the out years. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our kind of quick look at the budget. Happy to answer any questions that you or the members have.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo.
Thank you for being here. Pardon, and just, I'm not on a budget committee, never have been, so pardon the following question. What is the current number that you had stated was in our rainy day fund,
$2.3 billion.
Can you tell us, like, how is that invested? Like, where do all those dollars sit? How are they diversified? That kind of thing.
The state treasurer invests the rainy day fund just like all other state funds, and they're invested in generally, I would say, safe investments. They want to make sure we can have the money available to us when we need to use it.
So what kind of, could you give me an example of what those investments might be like?
I mean, we're not putting the money into the stock market or anything like that. It's going through banks.
Okay. So like bonds and that kind of thing?
Bonds and just getting interest from, interest from the banks and so forth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The pay-go shift. So if I understand it correctly, is there 574 million in pay-go now and 500 million is being proposed to go to bonds?
Yeah, so what the governor did was we were expecting, the governor's plan last year was to spend about 500 million of cash on pay-go in fiscal 25. And instead he's using bonds to pay for that.
So how sustainable is that model? Because you're going to borrow an extra $500 million a year. What does that do to our interest payments and jeopardy to our AAA bond rating?
So the state has affordability criteria on what's affordable in terms of bonds, and there's a committee of the treasurer, the controller, the secretary of DBM, and a few other people that had authorized a 500 million increase in GO bond authorizations for this year, and it still is well within our affordability criteria. So we don't think, on the face of it, that the bond rating agencies would have a concern because they like that we have an affordability criteria and that we make sure not to exceed it. But I will say one thing that like Moody's and some of the rating agencies say is that Maryland is for a AAA bonded state. There's only 12 or so AAA states. We are a very high debt state among the AAA states. So they'll have some concerns about it, but I don't think it would have an immediate impact. Now, if we keep raising our GO bond authorizations 500 million every year, we're going to get outside of our affordability ratios, and then we would have a problem.
So that was my next question. Does your graph assume that we're going to continue to borrow at that level?
The administration's proposal was to go up the 500 million and stay at that level, not go any higher in subsequent years.
So it would be 1.5 billion this year and ongoing.
It's 1.75 billion a year in geo bonds.
Okay. And then on page 5, when you talked about WMATA, as I recall, I thought we had a bill a couple years ago that gave them like an additional 450 million a year, and now this is another 150 million. Is the state required to fund that additional 150 million?
Maryland and DC and Virginia are supposed to pay a certain share of WMATA's costs. So this is our allocation. I mean, state statute doesn't require us to put this 150 million in, but
so the other 2 jurisdictions are.
I mean, each one is supposed to, and I mean, they have always adhered to whatever they were supposed to put in past years. So what we would assume that everybody would put in there.
So that would be ongoing as well.
Yes, and it actually grows to more like 250 million in the out years.
So what's the end game there? I mean, a lot of us in the rural areas got all the proposed cuts. And it's kind of disappointing then that we endure that, but then you see all this money going into mass transit. I mean, I think the 150 million would have paid for all the projects that were cut in all of our highways across the state. I know for us in particular with I-81, it was 15 million in state money and the rest was federal money for a $65 million project. So it seems like we're giving up a lot. What money are we leveraging anything with the money that's going to WMATA?
Doug Weigel, and maybe I'll just jump in here. I mean, it's a valid question. Frankly, I share the exact same concern. I think David's this is a policy question really for us. It's not really technical for him. So I don't want to put him on the spot, but trust me, I get it. I don't know that 150 million covers all of our projects, but I am very much concerned and hear what you're saying in that, it's 150 million now and there's no end in sight. Like where do we stop the hemorrhaging? So
okay,
I just don't want to put him on the spot for a question that is really meant for us.
Wasn't trying to put him on the spot. I
No,
was
I know.
trying to figure out the priorities. Okay, back to the PAYGO question. So how much money will be left in PAYGO for capital project?
And there's about 52 million of PAYGO in the 25 budget for capital projects. And then there's 22 million that we define as capital, but it's for the heritage revitalization tax credit. I don't really know that I would call that, capital projects. It's more of a encouraging private sector investment.
Okay, and what was your comment? I didn't catch it on the unemployment insurance. You said the trust fund was being reduced, and how much of that money was being transferred to where?
So the state is self-insured for our employees. So this money is coming out of the state employees self-insured account. It's not the larger unemployment insurance fund. And so the state has not been laying people off in many years. They have a large fund balance and they're taking 40 million out and putting it into the general fund.
That's just a one-time transfer.
A one-time transfer, yes, sir.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Sure.
Delegate Charkoudian, then we'll go Aronson, Pippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask about CEF. Yes, if you know, so I kind of have vaguely followed that, and I think I don't know that it's here, but when I look in the budget itself, there's some cuts to some of the MEA programming. There's like kind of 4 broad sections that are funded by Reggie money. And one of them is a low income energy efficiency grants, and the other is general energy efficiency grants. And I note that both of those have been cut. The Reggie money in those 2 sections have been cut. And then there's a third one, which is kind of more broadly grants for clean energy. And that's where you have some Reggie money, but there's also ACP. So that appears to go up, but I think that's because you're sort of budgeting for ACPs now rather than before. That ACP money wasn't showing up in the budget. It was just sort of sitting there. So overall, my sense is that the MEA budget using Reggie money has been cut. And I'm a little confused about this because I was this 90 million that's transferred to, is it transferred to MDE?
It's
or just generically transferred to
the
somewhere?
dedicated purpose account, which is like a holding account for multi-year initiatives.
Okay, so not any particular agency right now?
Right.
Okay, so here's where I'm confused. That 90, I've heard that 90 is money that wasn't being spent, which I would like more information about that because you may or may not know, but every one of us here have put in bills every year trying to be like, let's use some of that CEF money for this. And we're told there's no CEF money for anything that you want to do. So I want to understand the not being spent. I know Reggie revenues have continued to grow over the last several years and are projected to continue to grow. So I want to understand that if you know more about that, but I also want to understand, I have been told also, no, MEA, the 90 million is not from the cuts that I see in the MEA budget, it's from something else. So I guess I want to understand if there is a connection between the MEA cuts that I can see from last year's budget items to the 90 million. And then if you can say more about the 90 million, those cuts are not 90 million. Those cuts are roughly, I think they're like 18 million, but still I'm concerned about them.
So we are writing the budget analysis on that Maryland Energy Administration now, so I'll be better able to answer your question about the cuts once we get that done. Probably can just send it to the committee so you
That'd be
can
great, yeah.
read that. And in terms of the larger issue, the administration is showing before the 90 million transfer to the climate issues, they're showing $180 million surplus at the end of fiscal 25 in CEF, and it's about half Reggie money and half the ACP. And what they're saying is the 90 million, which would come, reduce that balance, could come from either. And their statutory change doesn't really specify which funds will be reduced. But so that's pretty much what we know, just that they're going to cut into that fund balance, so it wouldn't be there in future years to continue investments. I think the other concern we have is just that in recent years, we've been very cautious as a state in what we assumed we would get from the Reggie auctions. And so one of the reasons they've had fund balances is because we've been cautious, and then that leads to a balance. And this year, they appear to be being more aggressive in the estimate. It seems much closer to what's likely to happen. So that we are, that 180 is like probably the best case. There's not likely to be a big windfall in fiscal 25 like there has been in some other years.
So can you just explain to me the statutory thing that's going to show up in the BRFA? Because normally there's a couple of places in statute where, for example, half the CEF money has to go to OHEP. And then there's another place in statute that's specific to the ACPs. And I know there's been attempts to raid that. I personally feel very strongly about the money we said was for low income solar. Should stay with low income solar and shouldn't go to subsidize anything other than low income individuals getting to benefit from the clean energy economy. So I'm concerned that we have things that are written into statute that we have worked on in this committee. And I don't understand the BRFA enough to understand, can something be written into the BRFA that overrides what we have written into statute, and kind of how do those sort of line up?
Yes, so the BRFA is the governor's vehicle for getting budgetary savings or making other budgetary changes that require statute, because he wants to override something in statute. And so that is why this taking of the 90 million is authorized in the Budget Reconciliation Act, because he wants to sort of ignore to some extent the way that those funds are supposed to be allocated under the current statute.
And so is that, I have not seen that yet. Is that's something we can see where that's coming from? Like, do you know if it's coming from that ACP chunk of money?
No, it says something very generic, like the authorizing the transfer of up to $90 million for climate pollution, but it doesn't say if it's coming out of the ACP or out of Reggie. It just is generic out of CEF. So it gives them flexibility, I would say.
So if we pass that budget that way, that would override everything that we have put into statute that says this is for low income people, that's for low income people, and it could theoretically be used for anybody.
Right, we let them take the fund balance. It's not, they're not changing the allocations of what actually goes into the budget, but we'll let them take the fund balance away and spend it on climate pollution and not how it would otherwise be.
Okay.
As a simpler way to phrase that, just the BRFA is a statute and it overrides previous bills.
Correct.
Okay, that's 20 minutes summed up in 2 seconds. Anything else?
That's it. Thank you.
Dogan Aaron's.
You mentioned fee increases. Can you have that number again?
I'm not sure if I did, but I can talk about fee increases. In the Transportation Trust Fund, the Transportation Department is assuming 81 million of ongoing revenues from raising fees. And these are fees that would not require legislative action. They're things they can do through either AELR or on their own. So there would be no bills related to the 81 million. They haven't specified exactly what fees they're going to raise, but they've said that 40 million of the 81 will come from motor vehicle administration fees that cannot be vehicle registration fees because those are set in statute. They said 30 million would come from the aviation administration, which we believe is largely going to be parking fees going up at BWI. And then they're seeking 11 million in additional revenue from fees at the port administration, which I would assume are business related fees.
Okay, you also mentioned on page 5, I believe you mentioned WMATA getting 150 million. On page 6, I'm kind of confused. It said there's 167 million. Is that, how does that correlate to the 150?
So there's two different pots. There's 150 million going to WMATA out of the general fund for operating costs. Separately, the governor is using 167 million of general obligation bonds to help fund WMATA's capital costs that Maryland is on the hook for.
In addition to.
Right.
Okay. My last question is, I'm getting a lot of comments on, I'm in the real estate business and a lot of people are commenting to me about assessments going up. Does that play in this anywhere? Real estate taxes will obviously increase. Do you have any numbers on that?
I don't have numbers. Obviously, most of that revenue goes to the counties. The state does have a property tax, so it would have some mild impact in increasing our property tax revenues, which help to fund our debt service costs.
So it's irrelevant to this budget.
It's really, yeah, it's not a major.
When you say most of it goes to the county, how much goes to the county? I thought it was like 50%.
I mean, the state property tax is like 8 cents, 9 cents. I'm not remembering exact amount.
But you're saying, I was unclear. I thought most of the property taxes I thought it was like 50% of the property taxes go to the county. I didn't realize it.
No, I mean, the counties, whatever the county tax rate is, they get all of that, and the state has a separate amount on top.
Okay.
That the state collects.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the presentation. Like that you're a numbers guy. Hopefully you can help me out. The budget's very complicated, and I know there's some creative budgeting, especially as the budgeting challenges get more challenging. So without fee increases, without doing anything with bonds or putting our bond credit rating at risk, our revenues projected to somewhat stay flat, whereas our expenses are, increasing dramatically. I mean, we have Kerwin, those expenses are kicking in the next couple of years. You've presented that to us here. What would happen if there were no fee increases, and there was no additional creative, changes in the bond process? I mean, what are we looking at with our budgeting over the next couple of years?
Well, I mean, I think there's the general fund and there's the transportation trust fund. So if there were no fee increases, the transportation trust fund would be out the 81 million I just talked about, which means they would be doing more cuts. So it would result in more cuts for transportation. The same as we don't do the WMATA things with the general fund and the general obligation bonds, the transportation trust fund has to absorb that. So they would be cutting other things even more than they already are talking about. So it would be, significant cuts, fewer projects getting done on a capital basis in transportation. On the general fund side, there's not much in the way of new fees. The Department of Environment has a bill in that will generate, we haven't done a fiscal note, but has some additional fee revenue, but there's really not a lot of fees supporting the general fund or really new revenues supporting the general fund other than that lottery agent commission. There's no new taxes and there's not a lot in the way of fees. So the challenge is the general fund, the Board of Revenue estimates is assuming like 2 to 3% growth in revenues a year, which is, okay, but it's not particularly robust. And our spending is growing closer to 6% a year. And that's what's driving our challenge.
So, I mean, I think that's self-explanatory. So our expenses are increasing at a pace that's double what our revenue or our income is increasing. And so without fee increases or changes in debt servicing, whatever, it's unsustainable.
Right. Either you're going to need to be spending cuts or there's going to need to be revenue enhancements or some combination of the two.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So I'm looking on page 3. That's the
the graph that I think most of us are going to be sharing with the citizens as we're walking through this budget process, because the budget doesn't just speak to this year, it speaks to what we're doing this year that will affect out years. And then the question that I have is when I compare that graph to page 10, which is the blueprint costs, it almost looks like a mirror. In other words, I think you say in the structural outlook that K through 12 and Medicaid, drive a lot of this out year expenses. So the question for you is, I believe that it's education that's the primary driver over time. When I see page 3's graph, I think it's reasonable to assume, and I'm asking the question, is that primarily K through 12 blueprint cost?
Yes, I mean, in that like fiscal 29 as an example, 2.6 billion of the 3.5 billion is the blueprint cost that the general fund is absorbing. So it's 3/4 of the deficit is because of trying to fund the blueprint.
So last year, when we were in a briefing like this, I think this was something that DLS brought up, which was that the expenses over time that are driving this structural deficit almost went purely to free and reduced lunches. Is that still the testimony, or can you speak to me over the next few years as to actually what within the blueprint costs that are driving this? Because we've already done the teacher salary part. I mean, that's already baked in here. What's driving the growth? Because it seems like to me from last year's testimony that DLS was saying that over time blueprint is broadly mandating that pretty much everybody in the state of Maryland is going to be on free and reduced lunch.
So there's sort of two things going on. The blueprint as passed was going to raise costs $300 or $400 million a year through 2034 to continue to make enhancements to K through 12 education. On top of that, what happened last year was we had a huge surge in the number of children qualifying for free and reduced price meals.
Mm-hmm.
What we believe it was the cause of that. It was the first year that we had ever matched the school enrollment data against the Medicaid enrollment data, and they identified many kids who met the income eligibility for free and reduced price meals but had not been participating. Medicaid rolls are very high right now because during the pandemic, under federal law, we couldn't kick anybody off of Medicaid, even if they were no longer meeting the eligibility criteria, unless they moved out of state or passed away or something. So we have a very high Medicaid enrollment, which was part of the reason we had this huge surge in free and reduced price meals. Now we are in the process as a state of doing redeterminations of eligibility for Medicaid enrollees. We started in May. We expect that over the next 9 months or so, some kids will fall off of Medicaid because their family income has gone higher and so forth. And that should bring down to some extent the number of kids qualifying for free and reduced price meals. So next year, we'll see if that happens, but that may ease some of the big jump in costs we saw last year from more kids qualifying.
Okay, thank you. And really the last question is, aside from teacher salary and the programs, which I think most of us would support related to the children and free reduced lunch, but are there other things that you can share with us on this blueprint cost that's driving the expenses the way that it is? Like, okay, if it's not salary, if it's not necessarily our concern with programs outside of like classroom education, what's driving that increase?
I mean, there are a lot of components, and I'm not going to remember them all, but I'll just say, I mean, a number of the formulas for the students with various special needs grow in the out years. They get additional money for those things. There's, continued rollout of childcare or pre-K expansions in kindergarten, full day. There's a wide range of different initiatives within the blueprint umbrella that were phased in over time, and so they just haven't. In the concentration of poverty grants that we're giving out to schools with large percentages of their students who are poor will continue to grow in the next few years.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for being here. Appreciate it. This is a lot of work. My question is, the lottery kind of out there, I know, but the reduced lottery agent commissions, is that like the existing lottery agents that are out there, the folks that sell the tickets in their actual stores?
Yes, exactly.
So they have an agreement with the state, and then this is going back to them and reducing what they're being compensated?
Correct.
Okay. Is that, is it possible to do the same thing for the casinos?
I mean, you can make
That's-
statutory changes to the, the
But
way
this-
the money is
This
allocated,
doesn't apply to the casinos, though. It just applies to the smaller businesses.
just to the lottery and its
Interesting.
agents.
Okay. And then I remember a few years ago when Governor O'Malley was in office, there were a lot of transfers to the general fund, generally speaking. And I know this is a smaller number, the miscellaneous. Is there any way I'm just curious. I don't need you to rattle them off. I was just curious if you could email me that.
Yeah, I'll have to email
There
you.
were
I
some
don't-
unusual ones back in the day and. I thought that'd be
Oh,
curious.
yeah, actually, I do know what the miscellaneous is. It's just, there's a lot of money in the dedicated purpose fund for all sorts of different purposes, and the administration is saying, well, fine, 400,000.
And just sweep it in.
Yeah, but they did not specify which programs it'll come from, so I don't have any further detail at this point.
Okay. And then in the actual report that you have here, is there can you point me to the area, and I did go back where it has the county funding, the general funding to the counties. The proportional cuts between the counties from year over year. It does seem like some counties are being picked on a little bit more than others. So I'm just trying to get there.
Yeah, almost all of our local aid is formula driven by statute. So there's not much discretion for the governor. I mean, there's a couple of K-12 schools systems that got a hold harmless grant.
Okay.
Like Garrett County was one of the two. But there's not big discretionary decisions that are driving that. It's just the way the formulas play out.
Understood. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. David, thank you for all your hard work each and every year. We really appreciate you. Oh, I apologize. You're not off the hook yet. Second bite of the apple. Yeah, Delegate Frazier Hidalgo.
Mr. Ruben, I just wanted to follow up a little bit from my last question. Could you please provide the committee with the details of how that rainy day fund is invested? That's a lot of money and interest rates are very high right now, even on safe investments. And I'm just curious how we make that rainy day fund, how we are making that rainy day fund work for us in the long run. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, well, that concludes this briefing. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy your afternoon.